Kurt Cobain died on April 5, 1994. But 2 days later, someone tried to use his credit card. The attempts got rejected, and no one ever figured out who did it. That wasn't the only weird thing. The shotgun had no usable fingerprints on it. The shell casing landed on the wrong side, and the heroin in his system was 3 times the lethal dose for most people. Experts said he would have been unconscious within minutes. So, how did he pull the trigger? For decades, these questions stayed buried. Now, they're finally being heard. And what's coming out has shocked even his most devoted fans. Kurt Cobain's story begins in a quiet hospital room on February 20, 1967 in Aberdeen, Washington. And from the very start, his world was shaped by the rough edges of a town that had already begun to fade. His father Donald worked as a mechanic and his mother Wendy waited tables trying to build a simple life after marrying in July 1965. They moved from Hoquiam to a small place on Aberdeen Avenue, then to 1210 East 1st Street, settling into a town that carried the weight of unemployment and shrinking hope. This atmosphere slipped into Kurt's mind long before he even understood it. And as he grew, the decaying mills, empty streets, and heavy silence around him quietly shaped the way he looked at the world. Later, when people tried to understand why his music held so much pain and truth, they always found themselves returning to Aberdeen. Because the town seemed stitched into every word he wrote, while the world around him felt tired. Something inside him was waking up fast. By the time he was 3, he was already drawing with focus that didn't match his age. And when he turned 6, he picked up a pencil and sketched Mickey Mouse from memory so perfectly that his grandfather accused him of tracing it. Kurt didn't argue. He just grabbed another sheet and drew Donald Duck and Goofy Rye. There on the spot, each line landing where it belonged. His teachers noticed the talent almost immediately, and his sister Kim remembered that he could hear a melody once and play it back without thinking. Someone gave him a Mickey Mouse drum set, and it became the thing he loved most. Every day after school, he would tap his feelings into the drums, letting art and music grow beside each other without realizing how far they would take him. But life inside the house began to crack. In 1975, when Kurt was 8, his parents divorced, and the shift hit him harder than anyone expected. The court gave his mother custody, but Kurt moved from one place to another, staying with his dad, who remarried, then with his mother again, then with his Aunt Marie Earle, who filled her home with art and encouraged him to keep drawing. He loved her. Yet even with her kindness, the instability weighed on him. At 14, things got even darker when he ended up sleeping under the Yonge Street Bridge. People argue about how long he stayed there, but everyone agrees that the cold echoing space and the sound of the Wishkah River below stayed with him. Years later, he poured that memory into the haunting song, Something in the Way. The bridge became a symbol of his loneliness, and that loneliness became a part of every lyric he wrote. His teenage years turned into a cycle of moving between relatives, friends, couches, and places that barely felt like shelter. Aberdeen kept pressing down on him, and poverty shaped the way he saw people who struggled. He carried that empathy into his music, wrapping it around the characters in his songs. Even the bridge he once hid under returned years later in the title, From the Muddy Banks of the Wishkah. It was as if the town refused to let go of him. School didn't offer much escape. Kurt pushed back against rules and the people who tried to control him. He got in trouble for graffiti. And one of his earliest rebellious moments happened when he sprayed "God is Gay" on a wall. At 10, he was arrested for painting on cars. His anger at authority kept growing and schools kept expelling him. These weren't just random acts of a kid acting out. They were early signs of the voice that later screamed through his music. A voice that challenged everything around him. Even then, he was living by the same honesty that later made him a legend. Things shifted again when he turned 14. Through Buzz Osborne from the Melvins, Kurt found the sounds that shaped his future. He started skipping school to watch the Melvins rehearse in Montesano. He listened to Black Sabbath for the first time. He felt the punch of punk and the weight of heavy riffs sink into his bones. Buzz took him to see Black Flag in 1984, and that show carved itself into him. The rawness of the music, the noise, the energy, all of it opened a door inside him. These early memories would soon become the roots of Nirvana's sound. Around the same time, he saved $100 from Christmas and bought his first guitar, a Univox High Flyer. It was cheap, but he didn't care. He was left-handed, so he restrung a right-handed guitar upside down and taught himself to play in a way that felt natural only to him. That strange method helped shape the sound people would later try to imitate, but could never match. His guitar became an extension of everything he felt and everything he couldn't say out loud. When he reached 18, he created his first band with Dale Crover. They called it Fecal Matter. And in late 1985 or early 1986, depending on who tells the story, they recorded a rough 15-track demo titled Illiteracy Will Prevail. They worked in his Aunt Mari's home in Burien using whatever they had. The songs were raw and loud and sometimes messy, but they showed the kind of talent that didn't need polishing to shine. A few tracks later helped shape Nirvana's early sound. People who heard the demo said it felt like someone screaming through a broken speaker while still finding melody inside the chaos. And that mix captured exactly who Kurt was becoming. During this time, he met Krist Novoselic at a hair salon where he worked. They bonded over punk tapes and long conversations about underground bands. Their first jam session in 1986 didn't go smoothly because Kurt drank too much and threw up. But even with the mess, their connection was strong enough to keep them working together. Krist's steady bass balanced Kurt's wild energy, and that balance would soon carry them much farther than either expected. School never held him for long. In 1986, with a GPA of 0.67, he dropped out. He became homeless again, drifting through Aberdeen with his guitar and a growing obsession with music. He sprayed graffiti around town, including the phrase "Kurt smells like teen spirit," which came from a joke about a deodorant brand. That phrase lingered in his mind, and years later it turned into the title of the song that changed everything. Somewhere along this path he read a Buddhist novel about reaching peace through sound, and the word Nirvana stayed with him. He borrowed it for the band because it felt like the opposite of the noise and pain they had grown up with. Their first show happened on June 5, 1988 at the Central Tavern in Seattle. Only 6 people were in the room, but 2 of them were Sub Pop founders, Jonathan Poneman and Bruce Pavitt. A booking agent had switched their slot at the last minute just so Sub Pop could hear them. One person watching thought they sounded terrible, but Poneman and Pavitt heard something real and decided they wanted more. A few days later, they recorded a demo with Jack and Dino at Reciprocal Studios. Dale Crover played drums on it, and one of the key tracks was Spank Through. The entire session cost $66.17. Crover's drumming gave the band the heavy, sludge-filled backbone that shaped their early sound. Kurt even wanted Crover to join permanently, but the Melvins already had him. Later that year, Nirvana recorded a cover of Love Buzz, which became their first single when Sub Pop released it in November 1988. The recording cost $600. Only 1,200 copies were pressed at first. A guy named Jason Everman paid for the session just to support the band, even though he didn't play on the single. Sub Pop didn't like Kurt's first vocal take, so Jack and Dino re-recorded it and added sound effects by mixing a cassette live into the track because they only had 8 recording channels to work with. The Bleach session started on December 24, 1988 and ended on January 24, 1989. The budget was just over $600. Again, they recorded 28 songs. Chad Channing played drums on most of them, but 3 tracks used earlier Crover recordings. Kurt spray-painted the album artwork himself. The photo on the cover was taken by his girlfriend Tracy at a show in Olympia. Everything about Bleach was rushed, noisy, and real. When Bleach finally came out on June 15, 1989, only 1,000 copies were made. They hit the road to promote it, but during the tour, their van was stolen in San Francisco along with most of their equipment. They had to cancel shows and go back home. Even then, what they had created was strong enough to carry them forward. Their 1989 West Coast run began like a spark that kept catching new wind. It was 36 shows packed into a few rough months. And Nirvana spent those nights opening for TAD, moving through Washington and Oregon, and then sliding down into California with barely any time to breathe. The tour kicked off in June and kept rolling until August. And Kurt Cobain pushed through every mile like he had something burning in him. On July 22 in Portland, he jumped into the mosh pit during the show, fell hard, and broke his arm. Instead of stopping, he sang one-handed while Krist Novoselic carried the bass alone. The crowd saw the chaos and loved it. The band kept going even though they were exhausted, and by the end, they were worn down enough that a few planned shows had to be canceled. They were borrowing gear, sleeping in vans, and holding on to the idea that someone somewhere might finally hear them. That kind of grind shaped how people saw them. Raw, unpredictable, hungry. It planted their name long before the world knew who they were. Then, April 1990 brought a moment that would quietly shift everything. Dave Grohl saw Nirvana play in Olympia and felt something hit him. He was still the drummer for Scream, but he sent the band a tape of himself anyway. By September, he flew to Seattle to try out. On September 25, 1990, he met Kurt and Chris for the first time, and within minutes, something clicked. Chris later said Dave was like a tornado, the energy coming off him in waves. In October, he had his first real rehearsal with them, and the sound changed in a way you could feel. His drumming was sharp and heavy and steady enough to lift everything around it. The band became louder in spirit, tighter in timing, and the lineup that would later shape Nevermind finally settled into place. The music rolled forward in small steps that felt bigger in hindsight. In October 1990, Nirvana released the Blue single, which marked Dave's first official recording with them. The same release carried the Sliver EP, recorded on July 11, 1990 at Reciprocal Recording in Seattle. They squeezed that session in during a break meant for Tad. Sliver was the first studio track with Dave on drums, and the B-side Dive carried Kurt's vocals with Courtney Love adding hers during the same session. Sliver was recorded before ever being played live, which made its debut on September 22, 1990 feel like a test of something new. Fans loved it. It showed a band shifting from the rough edges of Bleach toward a cleaner but still heavy sound that hinted at the future. The summer of 1990 also brought the boombox demos. Nirvana recorded 12 songs on a cheap boombox with one mic capturing the whole room, the air, the shouting, everything. They sent those tapes out to labels hoping someone would hear past the noise. Producer Butch Vig did. He heard a rehearsal tape of Negative Creep and felt the pull. Even with the terrible quality, the hook cut through the mess. The energy shook through the static. He heard enough to say yes to working with them. Those rough recordings kept the door open and pushed the band closer to recording Nevermind. By April 30, 1991, things finally shifted in a way they could measure. Nirvana signed with Geffen's DGC imprint and secured a $287,000 advance. Sub Pop took a 10% cut. Around this time, Kurt wrote Smells Like Teen Spirit in August 1990 after seeing a graffiti message from Toby Vale. No one knew it yet, but that song would anchor Nevermind, the album that came soon after the deal. Signing with Geffen didn't just lift Nirvana. It reshaped the whole grunge movement. Suddenly, an underground act was standing on the edge of something global. The recording of Nevermind carried that momentum. Between May and June 1991, they worked at Smart Studios in Madison with Butch Vig guiding a tight 3-week schedule on a $65,000 budget. Kurt pushed himself in those sessions, overdubbing as many as 50 guitar tracks for Lounge Act to build the thick layered sound that later defined the album. Around this time, he used a prototype Fender Jag-Stang, a guitar he designed by blending the Jaguar and the Mustang. The design came from sketches in his journals and was only mass-produced after his death in 2002. Its short scale and alder body gave him the punchy tone that made Nevermind feel alive. These choices helped shape a sound that was loud yet clean, chaotic yet structured, and ready to pull rock in a new direction. Once the main tracks were done, they took the tapes to S. Sound City Studios in Van Nuys in June 1991, where Andy Wallace remixed everything. Wallace polished the songs, adding a chorus bass and using drum samples to make the kit sound fuller without losing its edge. During the mix of Something in the Way, Chris Novoselic recorded his part in a single emotional pass. Kurt listened and cried quietly, the weight of the song hitting him harder than he expected. Wallace separated the vocals, brightened the guitars, and refined the drums just enough to lift the whole album into a place where radio stations could embrace it without stripping its soul. Nevermind came out on September 24, 1991 with an initial pressing of 50,000 copies. Smells Like Teen Spirit hit MTV in October and snowballed into a cultural shift. By January 11, 1992, Nevermind climbed past Michael Jackson's Dangerous and reached number 1 on the Billboard 200. By then, it had reshaped what rock sounded like and who it belonged to. Worldwide sales eventually passed 30 million with 12.6 million in the United States. Everyone knew Nirvana now and everything moved faster. Their Saturday Night Live appearance on January 11, 1992 only added to that momentum. Around 20 million viewers watched them that night. Kurt wore sunglasses to hide a black eye from a fight with Courtney Love, who was pregnant at the time. Their performance exploded into chaos. And by the end, Chris kissed both Grohl and Kurt during the credits just to irritate the people he knew would be watching. Kurt was reportedly using heroin before the show, but the performance still shook the stage and solidified their place as the voice of their generation. Then came the Reading Festival that same year. In 1992, 65,000 fans chanted Nirvana as Kurt rolled on stage in a wheelchair wearing a hospital gown to mock rumors about his health and accusations that they had sold out. It was the same gown Courtney had worn when she gave birth to Frances Bean Cobain only 12 days earlier. Kurt pretended to faint, then slipped into the beginning of Rape Me, turning the show into a strange mix of theater and rebellion. That performance is still remembered as one of their greatest. It stood at the peak of their fame and captured a band standing in the middle of chaos with complete control. The story of Kurt and Courtney began years earlier, though. On January 12, 1990, they met at the Satyricon nightclub in Portland while Nirvana was playing. Both were using heroin that night and connected quickly. Kurt liked her wildness, and she was drawn to him in a way she later described as dangerous. She said she had been trying to quit heroin, but seeing Kurt pulled her back in. Their relationship became a storm. Kurt wrote Drain You about her. A song filled with lines like, "One baby to another says, I'm lucky to have you," that hinted at how intense their bond was. Addiction threaded through their lives together and shaped a love that burned bright and broke easily. On August 18, 1992, their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was born at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, weighing 7 pounds 2 ounces. Her arrival should have been peaceful, but in October that year, a Vanity Fair article claimed Courtney admitted to using heroin while pregnant. The line, "I did heroin every day for a month," ignited a firestorm. Child Protective Services stepped in and Frances was removed from their custody for a short time just 2 weeks after her birth. The investigation faded later, but the damage was done. The scandal stuck to their public image and shaped how people saw the family from that point on. A few months before Frances was born, Kurt and Courtney had married. It was February 24, 1992, and they chose Waikiki Beach in Hawaii for a small sunset ceremony with fewer than 10 people. It was simple and quiet. Kurt wore pajamas. Courtney wore a silk and lace dress once owned by Frances Farmer. Dave Grohl attended, but Chris Novoselic stayed away because he didn't agree with the marriage. Kurt said he felt happier than ever right after the wedding, but the happiness wasn't strong enough to hold back the pressure building around them. By 1994, Kurt's heroin addiction had reached a terrifying point. On March 4, 1994 in Rome, he overdosed on about 50 Rohypnol pills and champagne, falling into a coma for 20 hours. Courtney and Frances were with him. Official statements called it an accident, but many close to him believed it was a suicide attempt. Nirvana cancelled their European tour. Kurt entered rehab but escaped after a few days and returned to Seattle to keep using. Dealers were scared to let him in their homes because they feared a rock star might die there. Everything around him was cracking. His addiction and the pressure of fame were pulling him toward an end no one could stop. The pain beneath all of this had been with him long before fame. Kurt lived with chronic stomach pain since childhood. It was so severe he often curled up for hours, unable to move. He wrote about it in his journals. He talked about feeling empty and drained. He wrote that he hadn't felt excitement in over a year. He described fame as a weight instead of a dream. He cancelled shows when the pain grew too strong. His journals revealed how tightly his suffering, his addiction, and his art were woven together. They showed a man who created music that moved millions while feeling more alone than anyone realized. Nirvana stepped into Pachyderm Studios on February 13, 1993, carrying a clear idea of what they wanted, even though they had never met Steve Albini before that day. They chose him because his sound felt raw and untouched, the kind of sound that didn't hide behind polish. The studio sat deep in Minnesota woods, far from noise and far from anything that could pull their minds away. For 2 weeks from February 13 to 26, they worked in that cold isolation, recording in utero for a budget of $150,000, which was modest for a band already famous around the world. They talked early about wanting something honest and something that didn't bend to radio. Cobain even banned Smells Like Teen Spirit from the set list so nothing old would overshadow the new work. As they recorded, whispers began circling that DGC might not release the album at all because Albini's mixes were so abrasive. Eventually, Bob Ludwig softened the edges when he mastered it, but Albini's spirit stayed in every track. He later said it felt like the best thing he had ever done. The trouble started long before the album reached stores, especially around the song Rape Me, which Cobain wrote in 1992. It stirred fear everywhere. Nirvana wanted to play it at the 1992 MTV Video Music Awards, but MTV worried it would send the wrong message. Judy McGrath didn't want viewers thinking Nirvana was normalizing something horrific, so the band was pushed gently, but firmly to drop it. When In Utero was finished, Geffen worried about lawsuits and backlash. Retailers like Walmart and Kmart refused to sell the album unless the back cover was changed. Nirvana agreed to remove the fetuses and simplify the artwork. On some copies, the song title became Waif Me, a joke from Cobain. The label then brought in Scott Litt to remix All Apologies and Heart-Shaped Box for radio. Albini was upset because he believed the rawness mattered more than anything else. All these arguments spilled into headlines, stirring debates over censorship and artistic control. Yet, when In Utero came out on September 21, 1993, something powerful happened. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 and sold 180,000 copies in its first week. Critics called it fearless. The New York Times even named it the most compelling album of the year. Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies both climbed to number 1 on the Modern Rock Tracks chart. By the end of 1993, the album had sold more than 1 million copies in the United States and about 1.3 million worldwide. Over time, it reached 6 times platinum in the US and more than 15 million global sales. The album was abrasive, but it was real, and that honesty pulled people in. Nirvana proved they didn't need polish to stay on top. 2 months later, on November 18, 1993, Nirvana taped their MTV Unplugged performance at Sony Studios in New York. The room felt dim and heavy that night, and people close to the band later said they sensed something fragile in Cobain. He insisted on running his acoustic guitar through effects pedals so it still carried his haunted tone. They played Come As You Are, About a Girl and a handful of Meat Puppets covers. Cobain's voice cracked and climbed in ways that made the room hold its breath. He sang All Apologies twice because he said he needed the second one. Friends said afterward that he seemed relieved and drained. The performance became his last major appearance and is now seen as one of MTV's greatest moments. When it was released after his death, it felt like a final message caught on tape. Behind all of this, Cobain remained uneasy with fame. He hated how Smells Like Teen Spirit played everywhere, turning him into something he didn't want to be. He told Rolling Stone he feared being trapped by it. After he died, old wounds inside the band reopened. Former drummer Chad Channing sued for unpaid royalties, saying he deserved a share of Nirvana's success, even though he left in 1990. The case dragged on, exposing financial tension that had been buried under years of silence. Cobain's journals even surfaced later during the Nevermind album cover lawsuits, showing his own complicated thoughts about money and exploitation. The legal battles painted a dark shadow over the band's legacy, revealing how fame twisted relationships behind the scenes. Then came January 30, 1994. Nirvana gathered at Robert Lang Studios in Seattle to record a few tracks during a tour break. The session was booked for 3 days, but Cobain didn't show up for the first 2. Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl passed the time working on their own songs. When Cobain finally arrived, they ran through You Know You're Right 3 times. The structure formed quickly. After laying down the instrumental, they took a break to eat pizza and buy cigarettes. Cobain returned and recorded his vocals in 1 take, adding 2 quick overdubs. No one knew it would be their last studio recording. The track stayed hidden for years due to legal fights between Nirvana and Courtney Love. The master tape sat in Novoselic's basement until 1998. The final mix was completed in July 2001 and released in 2002, sounding almost exactly the way they recorded it. 2 months later, everything shifted. On March 30, 1994, Cobain agreed to enter the Exodus Recovery Center in Marina del Rey after a tense intervention and a near-fatal overdose in Rome. He stayed only a few days. On the night of March 31, he climbed a 6-foot fence and walked away. He made it to the airport and signed autographs before boarding a Delta flight to Seattle, landing at 1 a.m. on April 1. Before leaving Los Angeles, he stopped by Dylan Carlson's condo and asked for a gun, saying he needed protection from trespassers. Carlson bought a shotgun for him on April 1. These moments became the last notes in his final days of freedom, each one carrying a sense of panic and confusion. After Cobain died on April 5, 1994, strange things began happening. Courtney Love had already cancelled his First MasterCard on April 1 to track his whereabouts. Yet, after April 5, there were several attempts to use it. On April 6, at 7:07 a.m., someone tried to get a cash advance of $1,517.56. The card wasn't present. Another attempt happened on April 8 at 1:35 a.m. for $4,329. All attempts were rejected, and the bank didn't record locations. Private investigator Tom Grant tried to trace the attempts but found nothing. The mystery still hangs there, untouched and unexplained. One of the last things Cobain ever did was call his friend Rosemary Carroll on April 1. He told her that Courtney was trying to kill him. She later said he sounded scared and confused. In his journal around that time, he wrote, "Peace, love is overrated." A line that carried a heavy sadness. These words and that final call have been studied over and over, becoming some of the most unsettling pieces of his story. On April 8, 1994, electrician Gary Smith found Cobain's body while installing a security light at his Seattle home. At first, he thought Cobain was asleep, but then he noticed the blood and the shotgun on Cobain's chest. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide by a shotgun wound to the head. The toxicology report showed 1.52 milligrams per liter of morphine along with traces of Valium. A suicide note lay nearby and a cigar box filled with heroin paraphernalia sat close to his body. Cobain had been dead for 2.5 days and police had to identify him by fingerprints. Years later, in 2025, handwriting experts Don McCarty and Dr. Moselle Martin examined the suicide note again. They found that the last 4 lines looked different from the rest. They pointed out changes in slant, baseline, and letter shapes. They also compared the writing to a handwriting practice sheet found among Courtney Love's belongings after her 1994 arrest. Both experts said the last lines looked closer to Love's writing than Cobain's. Their findings stirred controversy and brought new attention to theories of forgery. Other details added to the puzzle. When police processed the shotgun, pen, and shell casing in May 1994, they found no usable fingerprints. The shell had landed to the left of his body, even though the gun was on his right. Firearms experts said this could happen if the gun pivoted, but critics argued the positioning looked strange. Police didn't even process the shell for prints until January 1997. The long delay and the missing evidence sparked more questions about how the scene was handled. The heroin level in his system raised even more debate. Tom Grant argued that the 1.52 milligrams per liter morphine level was 3 times the lethal dose for a non-addict. Others said tolerance could change everything. Some experts believed that even with tolerance, a dose that high would leave him unconscious within minutes, making it impossible to use a shotgun afterward. 2 syringes were found at the scene, suggesting multiple injections. People who believed he was murdered argued that someone else gave him the final dose. The chaos continued when reports surfaced about Cobain's credit card being used minutes before the body was officially discovered. The crime scene itself had been flooded with people. At least 12 individuals entered the room before homicide detectives arrived, trampling evidence. The first officer immediately called the note a suicide note, even though the main body never mentioned suicide. Critics said the investigation was sloppy from the start and that the mistakes made it impossible to trust the official version. In 2014, Detective Mike Ciesinski reviewed the case and reaffirmed suicide as the cause. He said nothing new supported reopening the investigation. He pointed to Cobain's tolerance as a possible explanation for the high morphine levels and said undeveloped film rolls offered nothing new. The case stayed closed. Critics said the review was too quick and too shallow because it didn't address the biggest inconsistencies. Then new voices came forward. Seattle musician Joseph Burns said he was inside Cobain's home on April 5, 1994 and saw 2 men inject Cobain with a hot shot and then kill him. He claimed Dylan Carlson was also there and knew what happened. His story didn't surface until years later, and by 2025, it had gone viral. He said he stayed silent because he was traumatized. His account fed the fire for people who believed Cobain was murdered. In March 2025, a Seattle attorney known online as iCupcake announced that new witnesses had come forward with matching stories. The attorney started the Justice for Kurt campaign, saying these witnesses had details never released publicly. Social media exploded with demands to reopen the case. The names of the witnesses stayed hidden for safety, but the attorney said they described unfamiliar people inside the house and inconsistent police reports. By August 2025, Radar Online reported even more handwriting evidence. Private investigator Jason Jensen shared documentation with cold case detectives and a King County prosecutor. Experts said the last 4 lines of the suicide note were likely forged. Frances Bean Cobain and Courtney Love sent cease and desist letters in response. The handwriting sheet found after Love's 1994 arrest resurfaced again in the debate, pushing everything back into the spotlight. 1.3s fast.